This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls, and this week, Simon Phipps and Jonathan Bennett join me for an end-of-year roundtable, only it's more like a triangular table, talking about, I think, the largest number of subjects we've ever put into a show, but it's summarized really well by Simon that really it's about observability. We're being observed when we don't want to be observed, and the great virtue of open source is that you can observe the code. How do you tie those things together? That's a thread that runs through many topics, and that is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust. This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 661, recorded Wednesday, December 22nd, 2021. Open source for observability. Hello again. Good morning, good evening, good whenever it is, wherever you are. I am Doc Searls, and this is FLOSS Weekly. And today I am joined by two of our many co-hosts who have stepped up to the plate, if that's what this is. Jonathan Bennett and Simon Phipps himself, who has the Christmas-themed shirt, Ho3.
At least I tried.
You did try. This is, for those of you listening in the future, this is 2 days before Christmas, or 3 days before Christmas in 2021. And we, so we're going to go over whatever it is that that people have thrown at us. So Jonathan, you have some stuff in the queue. I know that because we were talking earlier.
I threw a question out on the TWiT Plus Discord, the Club TWiT Discord, and had some people suggest some topics to talk about. I asked what the big open source stories from the year were, and I think people may have been a little biased towards the recent things. One of the things that got mentioned was Log4j, the big security vulnerability that everybody is pulling their hair out over right now. That's in the Apache managed library, Log4j, which is a Java logging library. And there's quite a few companies that have been hit by that already. And I know we talked about that last week, so we don't have to beat it to death, but it seems like that is going to be one of the big open source stories that people remember from this year.
Is that one of the kind of things that has a lingering effect at all? I'm thinking that like a supply chain or something. And I ask in part because I believe Alibaba, which is possibly even bigger than Amazon, was affected by it. But I don't know.
Yeah, and our guest last week, Giannis Weasel, which was a lot of fun to talk to, he made this point, and it's a really good one. The way Java development works, it's not like, on one extreme, you've got the way that JavaScript development is done, and that is all of the libraries get loaded at runtime. And so, you're always grabbing up-to-date libraries. And then kind of in the middle is the way actual system libraries work, where you update those with, whatever update functionality is built into your operating system. Java libraries are kind of on the other extreme. You build those into your binaries, and you do it at build time. And so to update it, you've got to manually do it and grab a new version of everything that uses it. And so there is this possible effect where for a long time, these vulnerable libraries are going to potentially be out there and causing problems. And so, yeah, there is the potential for a really long-term effect from this.
So, an interesting thing to me about that is that, there's this sort of assumption that open source makes everything hyper useful. Like there's more, the threshold and range of doability with open source is so vast, but then there's more opportunity for stuff to go wrong. And then it's easier to fix because a lot of people can get on it. But I'm wondering if, this is sort of a segue to, is this one of the ways that the world has become too complex, even for the best hackers, the best geeks to keep up with? And I know you especially, Jonathan, are over the security issue, and that's something everybody's worried about on a more or less constant basis. So I don't know if that's a good enough segue, but
no, that's a real interesting question, and something to keep in mind is the entire world of technology and computing, as compared to like human history, is really, really young. We're still figuring out how computer security is supposed to work. Like we're still learning how to crawl in this area. You compare it to some of the other industries that are out there, and some of these artisans have had like 1,000 years to perfect their trade, and computer security is like 30 years old. Well, of course, we're still getting it wrong. We're still in this, we're still in the period of incredible rapid growth in how computers work. So yeah, there are there are problems that we're still trying to figure out. And it's kind of the philosophical question gets asked sometimes, well, will there ever be a solution for computer security? The code wants to be wrong. It's just kind of built into it, right? And, I don't know. There are obviously some things that are being done right now that in retrospect are dumb, and people are beginning to realize that. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say what the next 50 years is going to look like and how these problems are going to get fixed.
Yep. So, I mean, thinking about some aspects of this, another story that has been going around, which isn't directly related to open source, is about how a company called NSO Group has been creating malware that is sold to state actors to target their political enemies. And so famously, NSO Group's Pegasus malware was used to locate Jamal Khashoggi before he was murdered by the Saudi government. And it strikes me that, at least with Log4j, we stand a chance of finding out about it before NSO has had anyone murdered with it. Their software is out there, and they're generally finding vulnerabilities in obscure proprietary software, because if they were to look for vulnerabilities in open source software, it would be too easy for us all to fix them. Do you think that open source is actually giving us an edge here, or do you think that open source is increasing the attack surface?
I don't think open source increases the attack surface, because guys like the NSO Group, they are genuinely so good at what they do. They don't need open source to be able to find bugs. And you linked in the back chat the iPhone malware. I wrote this up on Hackaday last Friday. That was it's such masterful work that they did. All right, I think we need to cover this because it's so good. Their attack, they wanted to have a zero-click attack to where they could send basically a text message to an iPhone and automatically install their software on the iPhone. Well, what they did is they have an attachment that claims to be it's a JPEG or a bitmap. It claims to be a picture, but it contains PDF code. And they used a very old image compression software routine, was created back in the days of sending faxes. And this image compression allows them to, it was intended to decompress such that you could do black or white the individual bits of a picture. And they realized that there was an integer overflow. And so they could say, well, when they set everything up, they said, this is our picture in memory. And then they overflowed the buffer, and then they could suddenly write to, all of system memory. They took the image compression algorithm, and by turning from black to white and white to black, these individual bits, and the primitives that this compression codec gives, they literally created a virtual CPU in the PDF that they were editing. And they then used this virtual CPU to examine the memory, how it was laid out in the iPhone system, and from there bootstrap to the next level, actually get the ability to run arbitrary code. And it is the most amazing and impressive exploit I've ever covered. It is just masterful. Now, obviously, these guys, they empower people to do some extremely evil things. And I've not lost sight of that. But the amount of work and ingenuity that went into that is just, it's it's breathtaking. And this was all done on closed source software. So I don't think there's any inherent problem with making things open source. On the other hand, something being open source doesn't prevent people from doing dumb things. It just lets us all look at it in detail afterwards.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is where the assertion that you frequently hear about how open source software, many eyes make all bags shallow, and open source makes your software more secure because you can find the defects more easily. I think people are misplacing their trust a little if they believe that open source is going to protect them. But I'm under no doubts that open source code availability brings with it a benefit of observability once you have got to go observe. And I think that's really I look at log4j and I see there is a vulnerability, and it's because programmers write bugs. They're looking at high statistics. The most guaranteed statistic is 1 out of every 1 people dies, and then the next one down from there is that programmers write bugs. It's at second only after death, and then taxes come after programmers write bugs in terms of probability, and so programmers write bugs. And so if there's code, it's going to have bugs in it. And all that log4j is once every now and then one of them turns out to be important. And thank God it's all open source software, because people can go and get it fixed and get it deployed, and they can go put mitigations in place everywhere. It sucks that it's in Java, and so we have to rebuild everything and reinstall everything in order to get it fixed. But at least it's open source, unlike all this NSO stuff where who knows what they're selling to the Belarusian government and which proprietary software they're deep inside finding something that is giving away the location of the next person that the Belarusian government wants to have murdered. Who knows? And we'll never know, because all the software they're targeting is proprietary. And even when we find out they're doing it, getting it fixed is going to be murder, if you'll excuse the expression, not least because they're probably using old versions which are deprecated and which the manufacturer won't fix anyway. So I think open source gives us a little something here. What do you think, Doc? Do you think that open source is creating a bigger attack surface, or do you think it's a net good? And I think you might be muted.
We've lost Doc's audio again.
Oh, no.
I muted myself because I was making some ugly noises. I think open source creates a much bigger resolution surface, a much bigger repairability surface. It's and probably even the notion of an attack surface is misplaced. You think about these guys going into iPhones, which are highly proprietary, of course, and ignoring for now the fact that if Apple would sell just as many iPhones if all that code was open as they will if a lot of that code is closed. You can hide an exploit a lot better, I think, in something where you don't have large teams of programmers casually looking at this code all the time to debug it and to improve it. And so I think the capacity for solving problems is much larger in an open source environment than it is in a closed one.
Yeah, I think it's important to especially when we're evangelizing and we're talking about this. And again, open source is not the silver bullet, but it is one of the tools that can help, can change the world, really. And it has. I think there's enough. We have enough history already to know that open source has changed the world. But again, it's not the panacea. It's one of the tools that gets used.
Well, I think Neil Stephenson, actually, I think in his really brilliant book, it's quite antiquated at this point. He wrote it in the 90s, called "In the Beginning Was the Command Line." Kind of makes the point that closed source software, treating software, he was looking at this kind of software that gets sold as a sellable commodity, that you take bits and you put them on a disk and you sell it in a box as something inherently aberrant rather than the natural way of doing things. To me, the model with open source is construction. Almost all the world's construction today is frame construction of one kind or another. There's a lot of proprietary stuff in it, in terms of prefab materials and stuff like that. But the way to build things is pretty well understood, and it's understood in a very open source way. I mean, almost all the home construction that's done in the world is based on an approach invented by getting Augustine Taylor in 1836 to build a church in Chicago, because lumber mills and nails were already around at that point. But rather than hire guys that would hew logs and notch them with mortise and tenon and dovetail joints and stuff like that, he decided, hey, let's just take let's invent the 2x4 and let's frame something up. And others called it balloon construction because hot air balloons were fairly new then and novel and considered weak and terrible in some ways. So they thought these houses would fall down. And in fact, what it did is it allowed many, many more people to become carpenters and to build. And but basically Neil's point with that was the more natural way to do software is open source. It's not the closed way. The closed way is largely a commercial invention rather than a technical invention.
Well, it's the creation of an artificial scarcity in a place where there is a natural abundance. And, this is why there's been something else going on this year. FSF Europe has had a campaign called Public Money, Public Code, where they have been trying to get the German government in particular, but the European Commission in general, to recognize that if we're going to spend public tax money on software systems, the resulting software should not be proprietary. And they've been having some success, actually. It's been beginning to get established in law in Germany that public money should result in public code. And it's one of those things which I think we as advocates should be pushed a little bit more towards. I think we should be saying more that the benefits of open source are societal benefits. If it wasn't a largely American audience, I would say social benefits, but I know we're not supposed to use the word social. I think that public money, public code has been one of those campaigns that I've really been able to get behind, and I've been really pleased to see it getting some traction. And I would love to see it transfer over to the US and to Asia Pacific as well, and get people putting that vast amount of software that is being created by the government out benefiting society and providing a commons that we can all draw on and improve, not least so that the next time one of us gets a head of state who is a jerk who defunds the public sector, we can go and get it mended even though there's nobody being paid to do it for the government at that particular moment.
So little known fact, when code is written by an employee of the United States government, it is automatically public domain, which is one of the reasons why so much code that the government gets written is done under contract.
Yep.
Yeah, so
you could fix that. You could get the contract fixed. You could get the contract fixed and require the contractor to make their code open source, and then it doesn't have to be made public domain. It can. Yes. Public domain isn't open source. You've got to remember that. One of my clients 10,000 years ago. I'm sorry. We haven't got the hand up worked out perfectly. I worked for Zenith Data Systems for a while, 100,000 years ago, and they were the guys that were selling $25,000 PCs. And I think that the contractosphere, I think, is gigantic in government, in federal government especially, and needs to be fixed.
Purnell's ironclad law of bureaucracy. If a bureaucracy exists long enough, the people that simply care about the bureaucracy will be put in charge rather than those that care about the mission.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's the thought just about government. It's a question, unless you want to go on to something else. It's on the same thread, which is that, and we can table it and bring it up later. I don't know. I read recently, and this may be wrong, that China knows everything happening in the Australian government, that there's nothing that goes on in the Australian government that's not known to China. And I wonder, would that be true if everything that the Australian government did was on open source rather than I'm guessing it's on Windows and some other stuff.
I would have to.
Great question.
I would have to know. Yeah, I would have to know how they have their hooks in. I mean, some of that could even be done on hardware level, which is kind of a totally different topic. The idea of open source hardware, but and I don't want to be China-phobic. I think you can go too far with this, but when pretty much all of our silicon is being made either in China or a place that China is very much threatening to invade, there has to be some thought put into, well, how much do you trust the hardware itself? And I know that sounds a little conspiracy theory, but there's been enough actual confirmed news over the last few years, I think, to make that a viable concern. And so, open source is not very useful when you, from a security perspective, when you don't have trustworthy hardware. And so that's something to think about too.
Doc, I think I'd reframe your question. I don't think there's any particular reason you should assume that any given government doesn't know what any other given government is doing in a world where, for example, Intel processors have a supervisory processor inside the processor running its own operating system, which is proprietary, undocumented, and accessible only to people who are authorized by Intel and presumably subject to US government subpoena. I think it's maybe your posit is that the Chinese government are more capable, but I don't see any reason why any government that hosts a silicon industry would be incapable of looking inside the affairs of any government using their chips. And I don't think it's anything to do with open source. I think that by the time it gets to be open source, all the security has been layered over the top of what's going on. And if you're using open source software, I've talked to the UK government here. Our GCHQ folks show up at open source conferences and give talks, and you can have conversations with them over coffee, and they're all using open source software, and they all fully understand the role that it plays in their infrastructure. So once you get to the software level, I think that you're in control of things again. The place where you're not in control is where every speck of solder on that motherboard could be a chip that's listening to you. And in a world where that's true, I think you have to assume everything you do is visible to the government that has subpoena power over the chip manufacturer who made the chips.
Simon, do you think that open source hardware solves that problem?
I don't think it does for a second, no. I think that the global security services have placed themselves in a position where they have the means to look inside whatever they want to that is done electronically. I think that if you want to be safe from that, you need to revert to using paper and pigeons. And make sure your pigeons haven't gone over to the other side as well.
Actually, I think both you guys made a great point. I think you made a great point. I mean, I asked the question, it was a software question, and you gave me a hardware answer. And I think it's a better answer, actually.
Do we want to move to the next topic that Discord pointed out? All right. So thinking about the big stories in the last year, because this one really started in 2020, one of the other big things that was mentioned was Red Hat. Well, two things happened. First, IBM bought Red Hat, and then very shortly after that, Red Hat made the announcement that CentOS 8, instead of ending support in 2028 or 2029, was going to end support at the end of December 2021. And that really rocked a lot of us because, people like me that provide support for customers, we started installing the newest and the best CentOS right away. So I had, already 3 or 4 CentOS 8 installs out there. And suddenly I'm told, well, at the end of 2020 or at the end of 2021, support for this is going to go away. So you're not going to be able to get security updates. You're not going to be able to get, new functionality updates, all of this stuff. You're just going to be set adrift. And, the solution that there's this new CentOS stream that you can use really didn't sit very well with a lot of us. And then, of course, there's been a couple of companies and individuals that have stepped up and said, all right, well, we're gonna do what CentOS did. We're going to recompile and repackage Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And the two that really seem to be in the forefront, Rocky Linux and Alma Linux, they both seem to be pretty good solutions. I know I got whispered to me in back chat that Simon is kind of put his oar in for Alma Linux. Is that right?
Yes. So I have been helping the Alma Linux community to establish their foundation over the last year. And so I've been helping look at the bylaws, make sure they get hooked up with good lawyers to make community-focused bylaws, trying to make sure that it's impossible for any one company or any one individual to take over the organization. And I'm fairly confident that at the moment Alma Linux does have a community governance which is beyond the means of control of any one company. And that it's a community-centric organization that isn't there to serve a particular VC or a particular concealed interest. Of course, I may be proven wrong. I may have been taken for a ride all year, but I'm pretty happy at the moment with the way Alma Linux looks. We made it a 501c6 because most of the funding was coming from a couple of companies. But I'm hoping we'll be able to convert it into a 501c3 public charity sometime over the next 18 months. And I'm very happy to see Alma Linux there. It's not posturing against anybody. It's not trying to compete with Red Hat. It's not trying to enable the business model of any of its sponsors. And I think it's a very good choice as a successor to the role that CentOS played as a downstream of RHEL. CentOS has now found another role in life as the Fedora of the cloud, you might say. But that role of being the unaffiliated downstream of RHEL, I think really needs filling. It's got an important role to play. I think that secretly it's what has made Red Hat so successful, is having those unaffiliated downstreams. If there hadn't been Fedora and Whitebox and CentOS, I think we might not have seen the success out of Red Hat that we have. But because it existed, it has become huge, and I think that role is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, so the reason that's so important for Alma Linux to be unaffiliated and the community in control of it is because that is where CentOS was back several years ago. And then they made the decision, and I'm sure they had their reasons for doing it. I don't know all the history about this, but they made the decision to come under the Red Hat banner and actually become supported by Red Hat. And that decision was what put Red Hat in the position to be able to pull the plug on CentOS. So it's good to see Alma Linux out there being community controlled. And then you've got another player, and this is kind of the direction that I've gone so far with my machines, and that's Rocky Linux. And it is not going the direction of being community controlled. And Simon, do you want to talk about that, or would you prefer not to comment on Rocky?
Well, because I'm involved with the Alma Linux folks, I would rather not particularly comment on what Greg is doing at Rocky. I have paid a little bit of attention to what Greg is doing, and he's got a path that he's following with Rocky Linux, and fair enough. But I would rather point out the things that we're doing with Alma Linux that I think will stop it becoming either ultimately a corporate buyout. Like what happened with MariaDB. MariaDB eventually was bought out by SkySQL and became a corporate vehicle. We ultimately saw CentOS, because it never became a public charity, getting taken over by Red Hat when they were. What I think happened in outline is that CentOS got into trouble financially, and the people who were involved in it couldn't sustain it, and Red Hat stepped in and rescued it. And I don't think that's going to happen with Alma Linux. I think we're building a set of structures that will result in a steady stream of income for the things that need doing, a steady set of technical activity by the companies who have an interest, and a steady involvement in the mirror and user communities that will keep it vibrant. And I think those three things together will avoid us following the fate of CentOS of being sucked into Red Hat, but will also save us from the other destination that you can go where a community asset that hasn't been tied down gets sold to a company that would like to use their strong new brand.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my perspective on this is I am excited that both projects exist, both Alma Linux and Rocky Linux. And I actually like the fact that they are using they come at it from a different perspective. The code base is essentially identical because it's a bug for bug rel compatible distro, both of them are. But the fact that they're coming at it from two different approaches as far as the governance goes, and that they're both out there and they're both exists, I almost see it like insurance. And of course, this is one of the things that open source allows us to do, allows us to have a fork like this, kind of a friendly fork. And so, if Rocky goes off the deep end and has problems, well, then there's Alma Linux that everybody can pretty simply switch to. And if something goes wrong, you kind of tongue-in-cheek said, well, if I've been taken for a ride for the past 18 months, if something goes off the deep end with Alma Linux, there's still the alternative of Rocky Linux. And I think, personally, I just think it's great that both of them exist.
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable outlook. And I think we only need two of us. Honestly, I don't think there's room for a lot more than that, because I think that the other thing that's happened is that the importance of having a Linux server distribution has become less crucial for the progress of the mission of open source software. Having one, Linux is now no longer pivotal to the open source mission, if you will. And so I think having two is great. I'm also kind of comforted that Red Hat has been so apparently tolerant of both existing. My friends and former colleagues in Red Hat have been very circumspect. They've been saying, "Yeah, we kind of expected this to happen when we found out that commercial was going to shut down CentOS, and we're glad that neither of you seems to be particularly evil." I'm going to be interested to see how it works out. But as I say, I'm rooting for Alma Linux because we've gone the direction of making it a community-controlled organization where if you are a Mirror contributor or if you are a code or community contributor, you can become a voting member of the community right now. You can go to almalinux.org and sign up as a member and demonstrate your bona fides, and you'll be able to then vote for who is going to be on the board of directors and control the direction that Alma Linux takes.
Yeah. So the other piece to this puzzle that I find fascinating is CentOS Stream, which is kind of the official replacement for CentOS. And it's useful to understand, I think, how the Red Hat ecosystem works. You've got Fedora is the upstream, essentially. And so every 6 months, there's a new version of Fedora. And Fedora is known for being very, very bleeding edge. You get the newest kernel within like a month of it being released, which is, compared to a lot of other distros, blazingly fast. And it's very much on the cusp. It tries to keep up with, the newest packages and everything. And the way it used to work is there was Fedora, and, a year or 2 years later, they did a freeze on Fedora and, went through all of their engineering to turn that into Red Hat. And so, the version of Fedora became Red Hat eventually. Well, CentOS Stream kind of sits in between those two. It's almost like you could almost think of it like an open beta, sort of. They take the Fedora packages from, I think right now it's Fedora 33 that has been turned into CentOS Stream 9, which is released, a full release of it. And then they also have Red Hat 9, which is in beta. And so you kind of have this flow from Fedora 33 to CentOS Stream to CentOS. And that is how, that ecosystem works. And then, of course, you have Alma and Rocky that then take those packages and recompile them, debrand them, and all of those things. So it's a pretty interesting ecosystem. And it seems to, as far as the technical aspects of it go, seems to work pretty well. I don't know. It's fun to see how they've put that together and how that works.
No, we haven't heard from Doc for a while. Doc, you watched all this.
What I find myself thinking is, okay, that's the Red Hat ecosystem. What are the other competing ecosystems, or do they even compete at this point?
Debian Ubuntu.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Debian and Ubuntu right now.
That's the other. That's the other big one.
SUSE is still there, you know.
Oh yeah, no, there's others.
Yeah.
There's SUSE. There's Arch. And is there another one that's big, or is it just those two pretty much?
This sounds like a great way to start a great big war on the IRC. As everyone was saying, but what about Mint? What about Mint?
Yeah.
Yes, I suppose Mint exists too. But when you talk about the I'm going to get in trouble for that, aren't I? When you talk about
get into trouble.
When you talk about the big ecosystems, I think the other one to compare to Red Hat is the way Debian and Ubuntu and all the Ubuntu derivatives work, Pop OS and all of those guys. It really seems to be the
not least when you then discover that the Debian derivatives that you don't necessarily see are what's running all of Google and what's running all of Amazon. Which I believe are also downstream of Debian. We talk as if all of these commercial operating systems are the biggest ecosystem. I have a feeling they're not. I think Debian is absolutely enormous. It's just that because there's not very much money flowing between companies related to it, we assume that it's somehow not relevant. But I think Debian is honestly it. I think Debian won the war.
Yeah, on the IRC, Keith 512 says Debian Ubuntu based Linuxes get kernel updates in geologic timeframes, and then of course, then there's somebody bringing up Mint and
Manjaro. Yeah, there's a bunch of them out there. There really are.
Yeah, but one of the things I always used to, when we were doing Linux Journal, look at DistroWatch. I'd recommend going to DistroWatch because they've had the same website. It's like Web 1.0, handcrafted HTML, and incredibly busy and noisy and still there, and reminds you of how many distros there actually are and how much they matter to how many different people. A lot of them.
Yes. Although I don't remember who it was that pointed this out, but you have to remember with DistroWatch, people have figured out how to game that system.
Yeah,
and so some of the statistics there, are not trustworthy anymore. Yeah. Well, so we did have a third topic that got pointed out on the Discord that we should talk about, and I am particularly interested to get Simon's take on this, and that is the lawsuit that's going on right now between VIZIO and the Software Freedom Conservancy over the GPL in VIZIO TVs. And the thing that makes this one particularly interesting is the SFC is not suing them as the copyright holders. So they're not saying, we're the programmers and we hold the copyright on this and you're violating our license. They're suing them saying, we bought a VIZIO TV and that makes us party to the GPL. And as consumers, we're suing you. And that is working its way through the U.S. court system right now. And it is going to be very fascinating to see what case law comes out of that. And I'm because this is kind of one of Simon's specialties, I'm super interested to hear his take on this.
I think that it's very interesting indeed. There's been talk amongst licensing geeks for quite a long time that there was a case to be made under consumer contract law for the enforcement of the GPL. So if you look at the way the GPL works, the GPL, unlike many other licenses, doesn't provide a chain of sub-licensing. What actually happens is when I give you a piece of GPL licensed software, the license says that the original copyright holders grant you your very own license direct from the original copyright holders. And so that means you have been given rights that are not dependent on the people that you got the software from for their integrity and for their protection. So that means that if the person you got the software from turns out not to have had a valid license, if they lose their license to the software because they have violated your right, the rights of the original copyright holder, your license to the software is still valid. And so one of the consequences of that is that anybody who gets a piece of GPL software has got the expectation of some rights granted to them by the original copyright holder, and they can go to whoever they got the binary from and ask for the enforcement of those rights they got from the original copyright holder. And so that's kind of what's happening here, is that in Californian courts, the Software Freedom Conservancy is acting as a sample consumer and is saying, so we have rights under the GPL to have the full corresponding source of that software that's in your VIZIO TV. So VIZIO, where is my software? Because you're supposed to give me the source code. It says so in this copyright license that I got from the original copyright holder. And so the very first thing that's happened in that case is VIZIO has counterfiled and said that there is it isn't a circuit court issue. They've come and said that this should go to the federal circuit because it's a copyright case. And so the very first hurdle that the case is going to have to cross is that appeal and being kept firmly within the jurisdiction of the California courts. If that works, then it will be a very interesting case to see defended. One of the challenges here is that it is very much a class action style lawsuit. I would expect VIZIO to have a great deal of money to throw at its defense, and I would expect Software Freedom Conservancy to not have a huge amount of money to throw at their attack. And so one of the risks is that it's going to come to a halt like the SAP case in Germany did, because the target that you're attacking is far richer than you. But unlike that SAP case, with SAP, the case in Germany, they had exactly one silver bullet in their gun to fire at SAP, and they missed. And I can't see that lawsuit against SAP, even though to my eyes, at least, no, sorry, not SAP, it was VMware. Although to my eyes VMware had a case to answer, they managed to persuade a German court that there was no case to answer and to have the case procedurally dismissed. And because there's so much money was involved in carrying the case forward, it looks to me as if Software Freedom Conservancy will decide to give up that battle. For this case, because this is a consumer law case, if it sort of works, if it gets dismissed procedurally, there are many, many, many other consumers who could have a go, pick the case up, and try a different stance at the same problem. And VIZIO should fear that, because Conservancy simply wants VIZIO to comply, whereas the next parties who decide to bring a consumer case under the GPL might well want money. And I think that would be much more concerning to hardware manufacturers if the people bringing GPL infringement cases were asking for substantial sums of money or trying to take other market-challenging actions. Honestly, I don't understand why VIZIO didn't comply in the first place, because the software that's involved here is all software they got for free. They probably downloaded it off the internet and are using it essentially unchanged. So why on earth they haven't just given the source over completely escapes me. But I think it's going to be a very interesting case to watch, and it could be something that launches 1,000 consumer law ships to enforce the GPL.
Yeah, there's a big question here, and I think this is what Doc wants to ask about too. Why isn't that they haven't just said, "Oh, right, GPL, here's your sources," and so the question that really comes to mind is, are they hiding something? Is there something that runs on our TVs that VIZIO doesn't want people to know about? And I know Doc has this question about data collection and whether that's part of the same pie. You want to go ahead and pick that thread up, Doc?
Yeah, I know, and I haven't looked at it too closely, but in their reviews of TVs, Consumer Reports says pretty much all of them have compromised are very compromised on personal privacy, and basically because they're using the TV as a way to spy on you. In fact, it's been said, and we should look it up. I'm pretty sure it's out there. That VIZIO in particular, when they were at their cheapest, I don't think they're the cheapest anymore. They used to be among the cheapest TVs. Actually make their money by selling personal data to the advertising market. And I mean, to me, that's a big question. And I don't know whether or not that's what this particular case ends up being about. It certainly opens that. It does raise that question. Right? What do they have to hide? What are they running back in there? And I'm not sure under the GPL, in respect to the GPL, I'm sure all kinds of bad stuff can be run on Linux, which runs in the GPL. So I'm not sure that goes in that particular direction. But I don't doubt that they have something to hide. I think the car makers and most of them have something to hide as well. That your new car right now comes with a cell phone, and that cell phone is informing on you in lots of ways. Some may be for your own good, or some may just be for diagnostic purposes for the company. But if you start looking at what the terms you agree to when you buy the car are, I'm sure there's that stuff in there. I know this is somewhat unrelated, but we actually decided not to watch. There's a show that we missed at Indiana University because we had to come back to California, where I am now. That we really wanted to see. It was an a cappella group called Straight No Chaser, which came out of Indiana. And, they were carried online. You could watch them for the next 2 days. If you went to this site and to go to that site, you download an app and you download the app. And if you look at the terms for the app, it says, well, we could sell data about you. We could give away data about you in the course of using this. And of course, we didn't do it, but unless you look at the fine print, you don't see that. And I think, that's a giant can of worms that we've barely begun to deal with. And I don't think legally is the only way to do it. I think technically is another way to do it. We need to be able to stop that crap on our end if we possibly can. And given that our TVs are computers, we should be able to get in there and make it stop. So maybe the part of the GPL that says you're free to do what you want with this code, ought to invite anybody to be able to put something in that TV to change that. But that may be asking too much because your clock comes on Linux too as well. So I don't know. There's not there's not an interface that allows you to get in there and deal with the embedded forms of Linux either. And that's pretty much what's in your TV is pretty embedded. So I don't know. I went down several avenues there, but the biggest one to me is just that we're being spied on at all times, and that's not good. And we need better agency at our end in order to deal with that. And that starts with the techies.
Yeah, there's a real interesting thread there about replacing embedded firmware. So there's a couple of projects out there that do this already. One is the OpenWRT is the one that I use, but there's kind of a family of projects that are all about putting custom Linux on little tiny routers. And that got started because of a GPL code dump from it was Linksys or Broadcom, whoever it was, back years ago. And a group of hackers took that code and said, well, we can actually compile this, make it do what we want it to, and then flash it back to these routers. And then you've also got the Android open source project on cell phones. And so you can put your own compile of Android. And again, there are several well-established projects that make this a lot easier. The one that I like is Lineage OS. You can take quite a few Android cell phones and completely overwrite all of the crap that comes from Samsung or whoever put it together. And there is a big market opportunity, I think, to do something similar with smart TVs. And, that may be based on the Android open source Android TV project eventually. And then you mentioned that idea about, well, there's no real user interface to this firmware, and could the license do it? Well, the GPL v3 actually has they call it an anti-TiVoization feature. It basically says you cannot lock down the hardware to the point to where someone cannot run their own software. This is putting it in very broad terms, of course. So, if there was a GPL v3 violation on one of these TVs, then you could essentially make the case that in order to comply with GPLv3, you should let me run my own firmware on the TV. And I think there is a huge gap that someone needs to step up and fill to have an aftermarket open source firmware for TVs. I think it would be a huge service to people.
So it would be deeply ironic if, in defense of not having to give away the freely available source code they downloaded without paying anybody, VIZIO finally gets caught up with by the California consumer data laws and discovers that they have a whole lot of much better resourced privacy advocates pursuing them through the courts. I wonder whether there's a theme that's run throughout the program here of open source giving you observability into your stuff. I think that's all the things we've been talking about so far have been, that's the benefit that open source is bringing you. It isn't about getting free stuff, and it isn't actually about necessarily being able to change things yourself, but it is about having observability into what the hardware that you're using, the services that you're using, the things that your TV are doing while you're watching Saturday Night Live. And I think observability might be the theme of the show here. Do you think we have a better theme?
I think there's a big one.
That's pretty interesting. I think of it like this. It's bringing the way that property law has always worked. Open source brings the way property law has always worked and applies it to tech hardware. So if I have a cell phone and I actually own this cell phone, then part of ownership is I get to control what happens on its processor. Just like when you own a piece of land, you get to control who comes onto your land and what happens with it. And in land ownership, that has been a bedrock of civilization for over 1,000 years. And with tech hardware, that's not been a thing. Your tech is controlled by whoever built it, whoever wrote the operating system. And it's interesting that open source gives you the tools to take back ownership, really, of your hardware. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, there's on the observability thing on our own back channel here. Simon shared what some reports has on privacy, how to turn off smart TV snooping features. And it's very good. And there are lots of publications that will tell you all kinds of things about how to be private. And yet nearly all of them are running spyware on your browser. And Consumer Reports is no exception. You go to Consumer Reports and you're being narked out to Amazon Ad System. I'm looking here, Parsley, Monetate, Demdex, over they are. Google, of course, there's a pile of, and they're not as bad as most of them, but they do play in that game. And I'm looking there at something called Page X-Ray. It's Page X-Ray at Foo Analytics, FOU analytics.com, pagexray.fooanalytics.com. You can, and we'd love to have Dr. Augustine Fu, who wrote that, on the show sometime, because he knows more about the ad business than anybody. But we're dealing with competing norms here. We have our own norms and I love Simon's point about observability. I think that's maybe even the most important thing. That's what free software said way back in 1984 when RMS came up with it. You need to be able to look at the code. In a similar way, you need to be able to know what's in the stuff that you buy, in the stuff that you use. What's going on in your car, what's going on in your watch, what's going on in these other things. And you also need to be able to throttle observability of your own butt, because you don't want to be followed everywhere, right? So, and those things all kind of come together. So maybe next year should be the year of the year of observability. I don't know.
I like it.
I like it.
Yep. There was one more topic that the guys told me that we had to talk about, and if you guys are ready, we can real quick. We're about out of time, but we can real quick touch on the Linux Tech Tips Linux Challenge. They've put 3 videos out so far, and it's basically Linus and Luke, a couple of guys from Linux Tech Tips, running Linux on their main gaming desktops and covering the ups and downs and the victories and failures of trying to do that. Have either of you watched that series at all?
I have not. I hate to admit.
Oh, you're for one thing, you're missing out. It is quite fun. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. One reason is, of course, it introduces a lot of new people to Linux and open source. But one of the other things that it's doing is, particularly Linus Sebastian, has run into problems, like major problems. So he started with Pop! OS and went to install Steam. And the process of installing Steam broke. And, of course, he Googles for solutions and finds this command line to type in, basically telling apt to install Steam no matter what. And it gave him a big, long list of packages that it was going to change. And then for him to do it, he had to type in, yes, I'm sure, or something like that to get it to complete the transaction. And then once that happened, it uninstalled his desktop environment and kicked him back out to a command line. And of course, they cover this on the video. And he's like, this is a terrible experience. And people, of course, were saying, well, you did a terrible thing to your computer. Of course, it complained at you. But so one of the real interesting things about this is there are already changes that have been made to Pop! OS and to apt and to Ubuntu, making this sort of thing harder to do, harder to screw your computer up in that way. And there are several other pain points that he's covered that just because of the size of his audience and how much attention he's got, developers are taking notice and they're saying, well, okay, I guess if we want to have more neophytes, as Doc would say, more muggles getting onto Linux and turning them into wizards, we need to make these things work better. And so there's several projects, KDE is one of them, that are very intentionally now looking at, let's get rid of these little tiny bugs, these little tiny pain points. Those of us that have used, Linux or open source, we've compiled our own software for years. We know how to live with them, but new people don't necessarily. And so I think it's really fascinating to see kind of the change that's coming as a result of the silliest thing, this video series about running Linux. It's pretty fascinating to watch.
Do you have a link for that? Is that in one of the several places that I'm trying to look at the same time? So I want to put that in the summary.
I will get you the link for that. It's on YouTube, but it's been fun to watch. It's entertaining, but at the same time, it's also it's kind of cringeworthy at times. But some interesting, like I say, some interesting changes happening because of it.
Is Linux ever going to be for muggles though? I'm just wondering if that's obviously you could get a Chromebook and say, okay, I'm a muggle and I've got a Chromebook and I'm using that. My grandkids are using Chromebooks at home from their school, right? So, then they have Android phones, right? So they have those, they're running Linux, but in a sense that you can get into it. And I say this is kind of like a former shade tree mechanic. I could work on a Chevy 327 or 283 V8 back in the late 60s and early 70s, right? There was no mystery anywhere in that car for how that was made. I couldn't begin to think of doing that on my wife's new hybrid at this point, and that's kind of the level at which we're using cars now, right? So not many people are driving a stick shift anymore. Maybe in Europe they are, but they're not here, and that's, so I'm wondering if is it ever going to be for muggles, or is it too important for and I'm actually thinking of the way that the whole thing moves forward. You have to be a wizard to keep using this stuff because you're participating in something that's a 10,000 point rolling average of lots of things working together that are changing.
Yeah. And there's even a philosophical question. Do we want Linux to be for muggles? How much do you have to give up for that to be a thing? And I think that's where Android and the Chromebooks, maybe that's where they shine, because they are the Linux kernel and a lot of open source software that have been kind of repackaged and, how can I say this nicely, tamed for people that don't want to compile their own software, that don't want to mess with the command line. And that's probably where, if there is ever a year of the Linux desktop, it probably is going to be something like the Chromebook. And I don't know, you might say that 2020 and 2021 were the year of the Linux desktop because so many people started using Chromebooks. I don't know. It depends on, I don't know if that counts or not, right? But there is something that I think would be lost if all of the distros tried to make Linux idiot-proof, because there are certain things, complicated things that we want to do that inherent in doing them is dangerous, right? Just because you want to do something new and complicated. So there's always going to be a tension there, I think.
The only reason that we haven't declared a year of the Linux desktop is because the people who want to declare a year of the Linux desktop want the thing that wins to be unusable by normal people. And the Linux desktop has won over and over again. You know, it's what I'm running on this screen here because I have a Chromebox down here. It's what's running on my phone because I have an Android phone. It's what's running inside my web browser because every website that I access pretty much is running on Linux. And so every app that I'm running here is powered by Linux. The only thing that I'm not running is either KDE or GNOME. And I'm not running either of those because they're too darn complex for anybody who doesn't want them as a hobby. And I think we've had the year of the Linux desktop. Linux won a decade ago. The only operating system that really matters to anything that's running in my office here is Linux. It's just that I never have to touch it because it's matured to the point where something else is in there. And then the other thing we've discovered as it's matured, as Linux has taken over as the underlying operating system for everything, we've discovered that the bad people are perfectly able to be bad on the Linux desktop. And so the problems that we are fighting, the grasping, rent-seeking corporations who want to charge us for software, the black hat hackers who want to take our data and sell it in order to take over our personal possessions and our wealth, they are perfectly happy doing it on Android or doing it on a Linux-based website that's running a load of JavaScript. And it turns out that the problem is deeper than we thought it was when we asked for the year of the Linux desktop. The Linux desktop isn't what's going to make us free, even though we may be free to make changes to it. And I think that's the big challenge that we've got here. It's what Doc is talking about all the time. It's that, you know, hey, we won and Linux is everywhere and we're still not free. What's with that? So what's with that? Linux won and we're not free yet. What have we got to do? Doc, what have we got to do to get free? You've been talking about this for longer than I've been in the industry. What have we got to do to be free? Everything we set out to achieve, we have achieved, and Linux is everywhere, and yet we're still not free. What's the problem?
Well, I think that, well, boy, what's the short answer to that? Actually, I think we need tech on our side, and not just foundational tech, which was what Linux is. We need tools in our devices that A, make things observable, B, give us ways of getting them to agree to our terms. That's one of the things that I work on. You know, why should we always be the dependent parties? Why can't we be independent variables rather than dependent ones? I mean, in many ways, we're just recreating a feudal system over and over again. We've been doing it for 700 years. And we did it with business. We did it with capitalism, and I mean that in a very broad way. We with industry won the Industrial Revolution. You know, I mean, if your name is Smith or Cooper, you know, or Weber or Weaver or something, that's what you did in the marketplace. You had a real role, and what we became was, you know, workers and customers, and we had a job instead of the work that we do. And we've all been part of industrial machines. And we thought, this is part of the idealist in me. I mean, I really thought in the 90s and the early aughts that with the internet, suddenly we could be more free than we were before. And in fact, we lost that freedom in ways that we hadn't even imagined at that point, you know, by becoming, you know, even more dependent than ever in fewer ways that were observable. So, you know, now we're spied on all the time, and we don't have much more agency than we did before. We have much more candy to work with, right? So everybody's satisfied. You know, everybody's buying from Amazon and not too bothered by what Amazon has done to the retail world. Even though you look at the empty stores downtown and you can see it. But the main thing to me that to set us free is we need tech for ourselves. We need tech for individuals that give us reach, they give us scale, they give us, how about tools for managing all of our data? Right? Everybody talking about managing personal data, saying, I want all my social data. What's that? Your social data is meaningless. What about your health, your financial, your property data, and managing that in your own way? Nobody's doing that right now. Nobody's giving us that. And we need that stuff. We need to get back into personal software in ways that we haven't before, not just with games and things that only run on Apple and only run on Google and only run on Microsoft. So maybe that's a challenge for the Linux and open source world.
Yeah, I think that it's mainly it's a challenge of economics, right? So it takes effort to set a service up. Let's just talk about Gmail. So you can host your own email if you really want to, but it is much easier to just sign up for a Gmail account. But that has taken effort and expense on Google's part, and they have to have some sort of return to make that worth it to them. It's an economics problem. And the return that they take is advertisement. So they track and they do advertisement. And so far, pretty much the only other model that we have that works is people pay money as opposed to advertisement. So, there are some email services out there that you pay money for and they don't track you. Most people are not willing to pay money. They don't mind being tracked because there's not a felt consequence to being tracked. It's not like it's, at least to most people, it's not so terribly invasive or uncomfortable that it's worth paying the money for. And setting up your own email service is hard and involved. And I don't think that problem is going to go away because there's some real hairiness as to why it's hard to set up your own email service. So it comes down to a problem of economics. And I'm not sure how that's ever going to change. I would like it to, but I just don't know.
Web3.
Yeah.
Tell us about Web3, Simon.
We're actually out of time, but we don't have our usual routines for coming to conclusion. So let's each have I've already sort of said my piece. You guys each want to have like a closing remark and plug your stuff, and we'll call it a more than an hour that we've gone by already.
Sure. So I'll just mention, make sure to follow me over at hackaday.com. This last Friday, we won't run an article this Friday because it's Christmas or Christmas Eve, whichever, or the day after Christmas, I forget. But anyway, no article this Friday. I think we'll do one next Friday. But this last one I ran, I actually had some original research in there. I made $4,800 by finding a flaw in Starlink, and I have it all written up.
Wow.
And it's all using really simple open source command line tools. It was the easiest $4,800 I've ever made. As my buddy said, they paid you a lot of money for running Nmap, which is about 50% true. So go read about that. It was a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. So Simon, how are you?
Well, not a lot to plug really. I'd be very pleased to have more people who are going to follow me on Twitter. And there's an exciting thread all about smart contracts running at the moment over on Twitter. The thing I'd really like people to do most is to go to join.opensource.org and help OSI as it welcomes its new executive director and revamps itself as an organization for the open source community. One of the aspects that we have had in the show here, many of the things we've talked about are of interest to what you might think of as frontiersmen of open source and of the internet. And it's very hard for pioneers to turn into settlers, and it's very hard for settlers to settle in as townsfolk. And organizations find it very difficult to go through the transition from being pioneering to being structural to being everyday. OSI is going through one of those transitions at the moment. It's turning from a pioneer organization into a basic organization for every open source user. And I would love to see the listeners and viewers of FLOSS Weekly go to join.opensource.org and get hold of a free membership and become part of that now thousands strong community of OSI members who are going to make OSI a vital force for the next generation of people who will be using open source for observability primarily, rather than so that they can run Linux commands at a command prompt on a black screen. So join.opensource.org, please.
And your new, was it chairman, president, whatever? Have we had that person on the show yet?
Stefano Mafuli, we've not had on the show yet. We need to get him on, I think, so he can tell you what his vision for the organization is. So we'll do that sometime early in the new year. We'll have Stefano on, and I'm also really keen, Doc, for you to get the guys and the girls who are, because at the moment the chair of Alma Linux Foundation is Benny, who is a she, and we're really keen to get the Alma Linux folks on so they can tell their story their way rather than my filtered way based on governance.
That's great, and let's get them. And I should put out my own plug will be for the show itself. When I look back, I did some looking. I've been with the show now a year and a half, a little more than a year and a half, and because we're a 14-year-old, maybe more than that at this point show. And we've had lots and lots and lots of people on, so many that I'm forgetting a lot that we had on. We need more. So if you know or are somebody who has something good to say and would love to be on the show, we'd love to have you. So, and you have to get past this committee.
We're glad to have you. We do have episode 666 coming up soon, and I think we should try and get a really special guest in for episode 666. I mean, you had a weasel in last week. I think we need to get a snake.
Last time we should
somebody from Microsoft.
Get somebody in it with horns.
I wasn't going to say that. I wasn't going to go there, Jonathan. So Jonathan has a new head of open source, actually. Stormy Peters has moved on from Microsoft to GitHub, and they have a new head of open source at Microsoft now as well.
Oh, really? And I haven't had Nat Friedman on, who runs GitHub, actually, and know him from all the way back.
So, of course, Nat is moving on from GitHub as well.
Oh, he is? I did not know that.
He is, yes.
Oh, really?
Yes, there's been a big rotation over there, which I'm not quite sure what's causing it, but it might have something to do with stock options.
Yeah. It's a public company. These things happen. Well, I have to follow up, and maybe now that Nat's moved on, he'll come on the show. I don't know. He's not replied to my reply to my entreaties earlier, but he should. Okay, guys, thanks a lot. This has been a fabulous show, as always, our last of the year, of this year. So enjoy it for 2 weeks worth, I think. And I don't know what's coming up in the new year, but it'll be good. I always forget who's going to come up, but we will have a great new show in the new year. In the meantime, I'm Doc Searls. We'll see you next time.
No ads, just the content. That's what you get when you join Club TWiT. You even get extras like TWiT Plus, our new bonus feed just for members, and exclusive access to the Club TWiT Discord community. Join now for just $7 a month and support TWiT as we continue to create top-notch podcasts you expect and deserve. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit to learn more and sign up now. Thanks.